to the fourth and last webinar on equity, privatization, and the right to education. My name is Amélie Gagnon, and I'm leading the development unit at UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning, IIP. And from the IIP offices in Paris, Buenos Aires, and Dakar, we support ministries of education all around the world to strengthen planning and management processes and hopefully towards more equitable education. Part of our work is through training, technical cooperation, research and development. And over the last decades, we've published different studies and methodologies that address the interface between law, rights, and education, and also how different policies, such as the regulation of private provision of education, can affect access, equity, and overall development. And so we are working on different tools, and now specifically a tool that will support planners in ensuring that education sector plans reflect current and forthcoming efforts in fulfilling the right to education. And all of this brings us to today. With the research and development team here in Paris, we designed a series of webinars that take stock of the most recent research in the area of equity, privatization, and the right to education. And it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Frank Adamson for this 4-part series. So it's already the fourth occurrence of this webinar. And we are really happy to have you on board, Frank. So you are an assistant professor of education leadership and policy studies at Sacramento State University, California State University in Sacramento. And you've led us throughout this series over a series of topics that we see on the screen now. And so we've had different guests over the last 4 weeks. And today, for the last discussion, we have Camila Crosso. And so Camila, you're director of education program, the higher education program at Open Society Foundations. And we're really happy to have you on board with us today. And so through these webinars, we've been discussing the definition and diffusion of private education and the different ways that we are engaging with private providers and the right to education. And so all the materials that we've been discussing, presenting are available on the website of the event. And so I will put the link in the chat box in just a minute. And we invite you to continue the discussion on Twitter. So we've been using a few hashtags. You can tag IIP, you can tag Frank and myself, and Camila now to continue this discussion online. I will leave the floor to Frank in just a second. I invite all of you participants to use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask questions to our panelists. And of course, you can select the interpretation in the language of your choice using the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. So let's start the discussion, and we'll engage with Q&A at the end of the session.
Great. Thank you, Amélie, and thank you to IIP for all of the great work hosting this series, and thank you to Camila for joining us today. I'll share my screen here, and just to flag people's attention that today, we're going to be doing more of a summary and opening more conversation. So please do use the chat box and give us, your ideas and thoughts, and we can incorporate them into the discussion. So today we're joined by Camila Crosso, who I will introduce more in a second. And, this is the trajectory that we've gone on, first on the introduction, then comparing the approaches, and then moving forward on education as a human right. And I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into each of these just to refresh your memory and to summarize. And for anybody who didn't make any of the previous webinars, to provide a little glimpse and encourage you to go back and look more deeply at those materials. So the key issues. So in webinar 1, we talked about the definitions of education privatization. We talk about how it happens, the pathways, and the diffusion where it's happening. And then in webinar 2, we turned our attention to the evidence around quality and achievement, around equity, and what different policy alternatives might be. And then in webinar 3, we looked at the right to education in particular as expounded upon in the Abidjan principles. And we looked at the pathways for the implementation of these principles. So to go a little bit in more depth here, the key elements of the definition of education privatization were brought together from multiple researchers. And they include the elements of funding. So are families or governments funding, the elements of management, who's overseeing the curriculum, the content, and the ownership, who owns the school building, the physical capital. And these three components can combine if they're all three public to be a public system. And privatization occurs when you have some public elements and other private elements. And you could, of course, have all three private schools. And how does privatization happen? And this is a very complicated chart, so I won't explain all of it, but we identified 5 different pathways: historic legacy, the dearth of public provision, a catastrophe as a instigator, an unfortunate instigator where it removes public infrastructure, an ideology, a rhetoric of choice that's founded on a disillusionment of public institutions, and then the efficiency argument, modernizing education. And so those are the different sort of large-scale policy pathways by which privatization can occur. And the mechanisms are, as we've talked about, private schools, charter schools, vouchers, and they occur in a variety of different places. And the list on the right in terms of the global saturation is by no means comprehensive. It's more to just show the examples of these different pathways and mechanisms. And then we presented the heat map, which shows where this is happening around the world. And just to note that these data are incomplete. So it's not a perfect representation of what we just looked at in terms of a definitional sense. So there are differences. And I've been going back and forth with Tony Verger. He was like, why is Spain red? And it has to do with the way that the country reporting occurs for ISCED 1, which is the elementary level of education. So, but it does give us a sense of where this is happening, and furthermore in the infographic. And I'm really sorry that we're not in person today, because if we were in person, you would be receiving one of these actually in your hands. But for right now, they're available online, and they do actually point out which countries might be at most risk by having a large out-of-school population. So we looked at the ways in which you could do something differently, right? And we looked at policy drivers, economic rationales, and education mechanisms, and compared a sort of a public investment approach to a privatization approach. And you can see the differences across all levels of the system. And really, this describes the decision-making processes that are happening and how different they are, why they happen in terms of rationales, and how they happen. And in terms of evidence, we then turned our attention to the equity concerns, which are the major issue that was brought up. And I presented some research we've done in the United States, where we see actually significant achievement differences for charter schools. They're outperforming public schools. But then we look at, for instance, the population of special education students in these schools, and we see that the public schools have dramatically different and statistically significant special education populations. So there is oftentimes the achievement question gets asked without asking about the student selection question. And what we find is that in many, many cases, the fundamental idea of competing in a school system through the market-based logic produces incentives to select students and to then have better evaluation through test scores. Then Tony Verger brought us to the global level and presented this very powerful slide of a meta-analysis looking at learning outcomes and the differences by different types of programs. And then really the major finding, in my opinion, is the negative equity impacts almost across the board, with a slight difference in voucher programs, but an incredibly serious concern in terms of the equity dimensions of education, which, as we all know, is a primary goal in the SDG and SDG 4. So then in the third webinar, we turn to the balancing human rights within education. So we turn to this idea of this red line, the core threshold for human rights. And we have these ideas we just talked about equity and outcomes. And how do we make sure that none of these human rights fall below the line of core human rights? When we talked about the Abidjan principles, the process of their development, and that we walked through the scaffolding of what they are in these overarching, so there are 97 principles in 6 different areas. And these are the 6 different sections of the Abidjan principles. The provisions, the protecting the right to education with the maximum available resources, the private involvement, financing, accountability, monitoring, remedies, and implementation. These are available online. I just wanted to make sure everybody has that link. It's available. These slide decks will be available and the link will be available. And then to remember that we are also releasing a book which goes much more in depth into these issues of the Abidjan principles and some of the key issues, both on the legal side and the education side. That is coming out in May 2021. And finally, part of the building capacity part is opportunities like this to have people become more familiar with the Abidjan principles. And remember, our goal from webinar 3 was not to present a comprehensive look at the Abidjan principles, but really to let you know how to find an issue in the Abidjan principles as we've laid out in the issues. And again, if we were in person, I would be giving you one of these, but I encourage you to download there, and hopefully we will meet in person at some point for me to pass you on. And these are, as Amelie has noted, the Abidjan principles are a key technical tool to help states translate the right to education and make it a reality. And finally, I want to just reflect back on some of the themes that came out from this third webinar. And it was this is a very quick summary. You were a very sophisticated audience. I thank you for your participation and the depth of your responses and questions, and we can continue the conversation today. But some of the ideas were, how binding are the Abidjan principles? Is ratification necessary? No, because they come from treaties that are already ratified. And then there were questions about monitoring and which elements should be in a new political constitution. Those are huge questions, but I want to flag them that they're there. And then there was this question about resource scarcity and real life applications. What happens when there's widespread poverty, and how do you address that with education policy? And I will just say briefly that one of the projects I'm working on in the United States is exactly that, to really measure what it would take to create educational opportunity in the school system, and then also what would it take to remove the social barriers. So that is an ongoing piece of work. It's very intense and rigorous, and a new line of research to really put numbers on that. And finally, just to note, everybody was reflecting that privatization does remain a complex issue, and it depends on the local definitions. There's questions of public-private. There's issues of corruption. There's the role of private companies. Hopefully, we can return to some of that today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Camila Crosso, as she's the Director of Education Program at OSF, Open Society Foundations. She was formerly in CLADE, the Latin American Campaign for the Right to Education, as coordinating. She served as the President of Global Campaign for Education. She's published on ed financing, non-discrimination, the right to education, and played an active role in the SDG 4 negotiations. What a resume. And without further ado, I would like to welcome you to our call. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Thanks, Camilla, for being here. And as Frank said, you have an impressive experience, both in civil society, in more political positions and strategic positions. And so we're really interested to hear from you, to hear your perspective on the first segment of these webinar series, and especially if you have any insights for implications for other educational levels beyond primary, or let's say basic education.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, IIEP, for inviting me, and also for congratulations for hosting the 4 webinars and this whole series. I think it's extremely relevant and timely, and I know it's been super well attended and a big success. So thank you for that. I'm going to take 10 minutes to highlight a few points on the issue of education privatization, and I wanted to really frame my intervention by focusing on the strengthening of democratic public education systems, right? So how is it, like, what are the topics, what are the issues out there that can actually be helping us as activists, no matter where we're from, where we're at, with which hat we are currently working, but all of those who are concerned in the implementation of education as a fundamental human right, all of us who are concerned and acknowledge the consequent role of the state as guarantor of human rights. What is it that we can do? Where can we be placing our time, our energy, our strategizing in order to ensure that this right is actually universally achieved and fulfilled to all people, regardless of where, who, at what time, or, as you say, Amelie, at what level of education they're in. So thinking through this lens of realizing the right to education, that's the entry point that I would like to give, that the importance of focusing on the strengthening of democratic public education systems. And then here, I wanted to open up and expand a little bit in this regard. And the first thing that I want to mention, and here I recall one of the slides that Frank has just showed, that talks about how is it that privatization actually expands. I want to talk about the importance of revaluing that which is public, and I want to underscore the fact that it's not just public education. I'm talking about that which is public, the public as a whole, and therefore everything that falls under this broad umbrella. And I do think that this COVID context did foster and does foster this acknowledgement, this fundamental acknowledgement of the importance of that which is public. And of course, I'm here referring especially to public health, but also to public education and the enormous role public education institutions and its resilience has been playing with all the difficulties that we obviously are perfectly well aware of. So the idea of valuing that which is public is a very important idea, because it has to do with awareness, it has to do with perceptions, it has to do with mindsets, and it has to do with really how consciousness are formed and shaped, and therefore the importance that for us to be looking at not only formal spaces of education, but also non-formal, informal spaces, and the role of actors, fundamental actors, such as the media. What role are they playing in actually shaping mindsets that can pave the way to either valuing that which is public or actually devaluing that which is public? So this is the first point that I would like to highlight. Another point within the strengthening of democratic public education systems relates to financing, for sure, right? And here, again, we can open up this enormously, but fundamentally, the debate is how is it that we can create and assure, put in place, firstly, a public awareness of the importance of investing in public education, right? So that's why I started with the valuing of the public, right? But financing of public education relates to looking very closely at domestic financing. And domestic financing, we can zoom in and understand the importance of legislations that are actually protecting the budgets of education, that are actually saying you need to invest a certain amount, a threshold, a minimum, be it through the lens of a percentage of the GDP, which is what we find in international agreements, percentage of GDP, percentage of budget, be it also through a lens of thinking about achieving thresholds of quality education and really thinking through the number of students. So there are different lenses, but fundamentally, states have to ensure sufficient domestic financing. And here, this brings us to other correlated issues around debt and debt cancellation, around tax justice, and around education cooperation. The whole debates around the Global Partnership for Education and other bilateral or multilateral forms of education cooperation. So this package has to be as robust as possible. And we have to always underscore that even in times of crisis, public systems, public education, public health, fundamental services, public goods cannot be definanced. Human rights parameters underscore that regression is a violation of human rights. And therefore, if we look at the many declarations that circulate around the SDGs, for example, the issue of non-regression is a fundamental issue. And now that we are under a very particular moment of crisis, we are unfortunately seeing budget cuts, and there has to be public pressure to say no. There are resources out there. The issue is, how is it that we tap into them? And so this whole package is not only domestic financing, it's how we relate domestic financing with global levels. So the debates around debt and tax justice, they are not only obviously related to the national level, they are related to the need to create global forums, global architectures that are actually dealing with both debt and tax justice. And there is now, for example, a push for the creation of a UN related body that can actually be tackling and promoting tax justice, which is thankfully higher and higher on the agenda. But there are a few other points that are fundamental within the notion of strengthening public education systems. And here I would really like to turn my attention to the valuing of the teaching profession. It is not possible to have robust public education systems or ensure equity or ensure holistic learning outcomes or simply the result of pedagogical and educational processes that are good, that are responding to the right to education, if you don't have a valued teaching profession. And I want to expand teaching profession to actually education profession, right? Because we have other professionals of the field of education that are not just teachers, but that have other roles within the education systems and that have to be equally valued. It is not possible. The right and the conditions of the teaching profession and its valuing, its deep valuing, is the cornerstone for the realization of the right to education. It will not be possible to realize the right to education if we do not value the teaching profession, right? Fundamentally and absolutely. And that means ensuring working conditions, salaries, and other working conditions. It means ensuring academic freedom, which is something very dear to Open Society Foundations, and that we at OSF think should be much more on the global agenda, like discussing what is academic freedom, what is autonomy of teaching, which we know has been utterly at risk. So the problematics around privatization of education directly affect the teaching profession. And there are processes of Uberization of the teaching profession, where teachers are completely seen as having to teach to the test, or having prescripted processes which are absolutely anti-education, because you are not fostering thinking, you are not fostering collectivity, you are not fostering inquiring, you are not fostering daring, you are not fostering questioning. And therefore, this has to be center stage in thinking how to deliver on strengthening public education systems. Another element, and I will be concluding very quickly, is the element of democratic governance of public education. And this, because we cannot have robust public education systems if you don't have the actors at the table. And here I do want to mention the students as well, as fundamental actors who are usually absent from the decision-making table, who are, there's an adult centrism that stands on the assumption that students aren't really capable of debating, which is absurd underscoring of what students are capable. It's really people who, there is a big distance. People, to make such a statement is to not know the students and their potential. So therefore, the students need to be at the decision-making table, as do the teachers, as do education actors. And this democratic governance is cornerstone as well, because when we talk about valuing that which is public, we stand on the assumption that decision-making is made through a process that is acknowledging public debate, that is taking on board these different perspectives, that is based on the fostering of thinking and of debate and of collective decision-making. So that which is delivered is a result of this broad public dialogue. And so this is a fundamental element of public education, the decision-making, the process of actually thinking it through and defining all of its content from A to Z. And to finish with your point, Emily, which is the right to education is not an age-specific, it's not age-specific. No human rights is age-specific. A right is a right, it's human. It's innate, inherent to the human condition, right? Therefore, it is not age-specific. So, really, the systems have to be delivering on the right to education from early childhood up to higher education. This year, we will have a higher education conference where hopefully the right to this understanding that the right to education is actually non-age specific and not level specific can actually get grounding. And as a Latin American, as a Brazilian, I can say that the regional conferences of higher education that we've been having, that we've had in Latin America, have been really cornerstone, very fundamental importance, because they clearly have framed higher education as part of the universe of the right to education and of public good. So I think there's more that I would like to say on governance and accountability, but I can leave that to the debate segment that we'll have subsequently. So I'll stop here for now.
Yeah, perhaps. Thank you so much. These points were so rich. I wouldn't know where to start, and I think I will watch again the recording, because there are so many important and interesting elements. And I think what you did not mention, what comes out is really that everything is connected. You cannot have a democratic debate or not have a democratic debate if you are not investing in education, if it's not valorized through media, education sector, and the communication community in general. So this is extremely interesting, and I hope we will make time to address the issue of governance a bit later. But there was an interesting comment in the Q&A box that really kind of highlights the tension between quality and equity, because if you don't provide equitable education, it's really difficult to say that it's quality, because if you cut yourself from a certain part of the population, whether it's marginalized students, girls, or whatever, you cannot pretend. I mean, even if the education provided is good quality, still it's not equitable. So I guess perhaps, Frank, you would like to add something on this, how the disparities in terms of level of inputs, resources are not necessarily the same by educational levels or geographies, and the different ways that states use to actually tackle, let's say, this broad education sector.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, and I do think that Joel's comment in the Q&A is very important. And just on that note in particular, we are working and with IIP on translating the Abidjan principles and with the Global Education Monitoring Report into frameworks and indicators to understand a much broader application of a human rights framework to education that accounts fundamentally for equity. So, Tony's findings are we have a traditional perspective that achievement is some kind of definer of quality, and that is in its own way anachronistic. We're moving on from that. And so the question is how to do that in a very specific way and in a thoughtful way that really takes into account the Abidjan principle, the totality of the right to education. And that work is absolutely underway in a very serious way across multiple institutions. On the resource and variation, I think across levels and geographies, I appreciated Camilla's broad overview of major components of what we're talking about right now in terms of democracy, in terms of the public, in terms of what we really need to foster in our education systems. And sort of what I would like to highlight here is that there are not exactly the same challenges in different places, right? So you have low-fee private schools in Africa. That's not the same as what's going on in Latin America. And I'll leave that to Camilla to discuss. But you have these issues of shadow schooling in East Asia, and now that's expanding to Africa. So it gets us into this question of policy borrowing. But just to stay on the shadow schooling for a second, we haven't talked about it really, but it is another area of private actor involvement. And it can take away some of the best teachers from schools because they're going to work for additional money and maybe even more money in the shadow institutions, tutorial centers. So this gets back to Camilla's point about investing publicly in your teachers and keeping them in the classrooms where they need to teach everybody. Otherwise, you're fostering inequity indirectly through a failure to fund, which goes back to our resource question. And I'm not going to repeat, but just like the domestic and international financing questions that Camilla brought up are very real. And so that gets to Amelie's point of it being interlocked. Not to make it too complicated, but there are some key issues that need to be addressed. And then, I think one other thing, just in terms of this comparison of what we were talking about a market-based or privatization approach comparing to a public investment approach, one of the things that happened in Sweden and Finland is that their PISA scores have converged. And in particular, Finland's scores have gone down a bit. And so then there's this question of, okay, so then should we look at East Asia for their PISA scores staying high? And, one of the Finnish authors that I've been reading was pointing out that Finland actually on the axis of both educational achievement and country happiness is the only country that's in the upper quadrant for both of those. So there's this question of shadow schooling, stress on the student, and really fundamentally how we organize our society in terms of, are we privileging this competitive zero-sum game, or are we investing sufficiently in the public so that education doesn't carry everything in terms of the life opportunity of a person, right? So that, and to just translate that into the human rights lens, so that education doesn't become about these test scores, but it is really what I said before, the full development of the human personality. And that is not, that is written and enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's not just a statement that I'm making. That's something that we have said that we're going to do globally for the last 3/4 of a century. So how do we actually realize that is a real question that we need to take very seriously. With that, I'll pass back to you or Camilla if she wants to comment.
Yes, thanks. I don't know, Camilla, if you want to react to or complement what Frank just mentioned.
I'm here. I want to also respond to some of these excellent comments that are here in the chat. I don't know if I can do this now or.
Yeah, for sure. I think you can go, because many questions are related to what is being said, and I think many of the points that Frank also mentioned can segue easily into the governance issue. And in the comments or in the chat, we see also a few questions about how. And you mentioned it also in your initial comments. The crisis situation or the pandemic, COVID, has kind of put pressure on governments, but also kind of created opportunities for the whole edtech or some mobile companies that also provide free services. So it becomes there's really clearly an issue around education governance that is raising or emphasized with COVID.
For sure. I think that there are a couple of comments in the chat that point to this issue of disaster capitalism, right? And what's currently underway as a terrain, as a radical example, let's say, of that. Disaster capitalism, I do think that it's a concern at the global level. I do think that it is something that it is discussed, as the colleague that refers to it in the chat mentions, in some cases like Haiti or other specific cases. But in fact, what we are seeing is in a context of multiple crises, even before the COVID pandemic came on board, there is a narrative which is very deeply installed of education crisis. The concept of crisis is part of the vocabulary, let's say, that is out there in the global agenda of education. And it, let's say, favors in a certain manner the logics of disaster capitalism. And in practice, we do see scenarios of crisis, be it that's coming from all sorts of crises and wars and natural disasters or man-made disasters, but that is actually paving the way for the logic of disaster capitalism. And I do think that we have to be profoundly wary of that and anticipate its problematics and try to address it really. The current context, I think, that can lean towards both there is a context of disaster capitalism. There is a context of ed tech coming in. And again, this articulates with dismantling of schools to some extent, but also it directly affects the teaching profession, because of course, then the role of the teachers again become even less valued and less fundamental and less holistic, replaceable. And the understanding of education as a fundamental human right and a concept of quality education to the broadest extent implies the role of teachers as paramount importance and never being substituted by any form of edtech, even if we do want to, let's say, democratize opportunities to all, but never at the expense of deconstructing the teaching profession. So I do think that for our current context, disaster capitalism is something for us to be extremely wary of. And we should, in fact, be taking the COVID context as as something for us to rally in the direction of strengthening systems. It shows how important it is to have robust and solid public systems, health systems, education systems, and other public systems. I wanted to also just mention two other points that were referred to. My definition of the right to education and of quality education absolutely encompasses equity. I was just referring perhaps to certain dimensions when I was speaking that was making a certain point, but I do think it's fundamental to look at equity. For me, equity is part of quality, in fact. My lens is the right to education, and so I tend not to, let's say, separate quality education has to encompass equity, and they are both part and parcel of the right to education, right? So we could never talk about outcomes at the expense of universalization, for example. And in fact, I have deep concerns, and in the negotiations of the SDG 4, colleagues who have followed the negotiations closely know to what extent we had a battlefield really to not have reductionist approaches of measurable learning outcomes, and in fact having much more holistic perspectives of quality education and of equity and of inclusion being part, in fact, of the narrative of the goal. So all of those words that are present today in the title of SDG 4 were fought for, were dearly fought for. So the notion of equity, inclusion, and quality, they really do go hand in hand. And then just responding a little bit to this notion of that Peter brought to the forefront, coming from a more legal perspective, it is true, he is saying that the right to education has different narratives. If you look at the international conventions, the narrative slightly differs when you are talking about compulsory education, right, than non-compulsory levels of education. However, we also know that these same international standards do talk about the progressive realization of free education, for example, to all the different levels. And you have different countries, such as mine, Brazil, where even the non-compulsory levels of education necessarily have to be free if they are public, which is the case of early childhood education and of higher education. And if you look, for example, at the resolutions that I mentioned, the regional resolutions of higher education is actually put forward as part of the right. So, of course, we have to be always cautious and definitely not make space for any sort of regression. But in fact, if we can take steps forward to consolidate this idea of the right to education cutting across, being inherently human, if we can consolidate this idea, from my perspective, it would be a meaningful one for those of us who are, in this struggle for the realization of education.
Thanks. Frank, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I really appreciate having such an engaged audience, because we just lifted my disaster capitalism talking point right off my page. So, but I do think that it is a very important point that what we see now is the global opportunity for the takeover model of that is described by Naomi Klein in the shock doctrine. It's not a phenomena of a incremental longitudinal increase in saturation. It is the shock doctrine. It is to come over and wholesale take over a system. I described this in depth in New Orleans. We talked about Haiti, Puerto Rico. And in some sense, Chile had that happen, at a national level due to the dictatorship. So and now we're in a global pandemic where the opportunity is around the world. And so there are some key guardrails that need to be in place here. The idea of supplement but not supplant, right? That we all need education technology right now to communicate, because being in person is dangerous. So does that mean that our education systems should become technology dependent or technology based? No, we need to have teachers in our classrooms going forward. We're in an emergency and we're in a pandemic. That's not what we hope to be normal operating procedure. And so but at the same time, I think there is a role certainly for, we are using the technology. There is a role for that. And that's why I say supplement, but not supplant, right? There still is a massive need for teachers and for that one-to-one human contact and the development of the full personality. So, and then I do want to just also highlight, I was looking into that UNESCO's report last night about COVID responses, and before that, I was talking to my wife saying, this is really a global opportunity to rethink what we're doing, and it's almost a requirement here. Because, and just to quote the UNESCO report, despite the great challenges presented by this crisis, this situation also offers the opportunity to rethink the overall purpose, role, content, and delivery of education. And then at the end, by tapping into collective experiences and practices from around the world. So what would that mean to not have an education system driven by the economic rationales propagated by the global north, but to really talk about a global human rights system? And by the way, COVID is a very hopefully shorter range issue. We also have a societal climate change challenge that is facing us. And we do need to fundamentally prepare our students, which is the role of education, for navigating the challenges of the 21st century, right? And I don't mean learning how to code data. I mean learning how to live ecologically appropriately on our planet. And that is a fundamental requirement. So we need to, this is an opportunity, right? We can either go in the direction of, okay, let's allow the entire techification of our education systems, where we displace our teachers through curricula that are developed in different countries and deployed via tablets, which is what is happening in a lot of places. Or we can rethink about what our relationship is to ourselves, our society, our political structures, and our planet, so that we can actually get our students ready for the challenges, the very real challenges that are coming up. And I want to quote here Martin Carnoy, because we were presenting Global Education Reform, our book, in CIES in 2017. I don't recall the city, but he said, this whole, Martin has a very, he'll just make an aside and say a very profound comment. But he said, this whole neoliberalism thing, it's just a distraction. The very hard work of educating people well is hard work. And so my comment today is for all of us to take up the challenge of the hard work of doing education well, and to not outsource it and follow the subsidiary state model, where we allow private actors who aren't representing the democratic institutions that Camilla is talking about, who aren't beholden into the public interest by stipulation, by law. They're beholden to shareholders, right? That's the role. And how do we not allow that to define the discourse of how we actually organize our education systems? And there are examples of how it has been done differently. They are successful. I get that the pressures are real. The money is unbelievable. We're talking about a global education industry of over $5 trillion, if you think about it as an industry instead of a sector. And that's a lot of money. So I get it, but at the same time, think about what's at stake for our students and honestly for the planet. So I mean, I want to ground that in the COVID conversation, but also really expand it and really draw on the UNESCO statement, because if we are to take that opportunity seriously, it has implications for how we would move forward.
Thanks for this. These are really rich discussions, and I wouldn't know how to organize. How do we tackle this hard work, right? When we prepared this last webinar, we discussed a bit, about the different actors that are involved. Who are the stakeholders who can play a role? What are the different kind of policy options that we can discuss? But again, I think going back to what you just said, Frank, and also what Camila mentioned is there are kind of historical power dynamics in education, and perhaps as you quoted the UNESCO statement, it is perhaps time not only to rethink education, but to also rethink the funding models, the power dynamics, the stakeholders, how we kind of how we think about education and what it actually can be. Instead of what it was in the past. I see that some other comments and questions are coming in, but I see also time flying. So perhaps, what if you would take the floor, Camila, and then Frank, to perhaps propose some final statements, or maybe a conclusion, or perhaps a few steps forwards. Let's say that we're in the shoes of planners and managers in the Ministry of Education. What could we do first? Let's say, what could we examine first?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Shall I kick off, Frank? Were you? Well, I know that time is finishing, but I just wanted to make another point. I'll try to wrap it up into the concluding remarks.
Perfect.
I wanted to really draw attention to this issue of governance, right? Because at least in Latin America but I think in other parts of the world at global level, something that has been drawing a lot of attention of researchers and activists is how, let's say, the privatization, let's say, of the decision-making process, or the privatization of policy itself. So I think that Frank, in one of his slides, mentions it also in terms of like the governance of the education system. But as activists, researchers, all of us here present today, something for us to look at. How is it that certain private actors, usually those that are economically advantaged, right? So corporate private actors, they're actually starting to enter the mechanics of decision making. And there are various forms that this can take place. One is simply lobbying, right? So like organizing around networks of policy making, advocacy networks or lobby networks that actually end up having an enormous amount of leeway, of entry point in government sectors, and where there is a blurring of boundaries between the public and the private. And actually these actors enter the public sphere and have an active role in the decision making. And this blurring, it takes many forms, right? It can be more from the outside to the inside, so pressure groups, or it can actually be the creation of certain architectures within the public sphere that is composed of very powerful corporate actors. So this is just something for us to be attentive to, right? Because what does it imply in terms of state accountability to citizenship? So what does it imply in terms of how decisions are actually being made? And here again, the idea of a democratic governance, the idea that education actors, students, and teachers can be at the policy decision-making table to debate that education. So I really want to, it's a good place actually to end, I would say, because as a next step, or answering your question, like what are the emphasis? One of them is it really is the democratic governance. Do countries and do systems have councils, have democratic, legally established mechanisms, tables, panels, structures where different actors can come together, debate, decide, think through in the interest of the public and through a debate that is public, how that system is going to be operating. So I think that is really important. And obviously, democratic governance at the national level definitely has to be consolidated, but it should be present at the different levels. Like this dialogue and this possibility of democratic governance should be a matter of principle. And then, I mean, I would just round up with what I was saying at the very beginning. How is it that we can be really strengthening the public education systems by valuing that which is public, by ensuring that the teaching profession is valued, and by ensuring that there are financing mechanisms in place, and that we deconstruct the idea that there is no money. There is money. The question is, how is it that we tap into it and really use it for these ends, for strengthening public education, public health, and other public services. Thank you.
Frank?
Thank you, Camilla. As we wrap up this webinar series, I think just to reflect on some of the key points, and I'm going to actually put the COVID response document that I was referencing in the this is the entirety of the UNESCO COVID response. I don't have time I can't find the original document, but you should check all of these out actually. Emily, I think that's to you only, so maybe you could populate it.
Yeah, for sure.
So the framing of this entire series is first and foremost to become familiar with the totality of the issues, right? There's been a lot of research and a lot of thinking, and not everybody's operating sort of on an asymmetrical information availability, right? So some people don't understand the phenomena of privatization. Other people are unaware of the right to education, and certainly in some cases, the Abidjan principles. So I think the main thrust of this is to be aware of the phenomena that are happening, how they're happening, why they're happening, and what the findings are. And then in terms of privatization, and also on the public and public investment side, and then to know the intersection of those findings and those trajectories with the right to education, and the focus on equity, and the focus on the responsibility and obligations of the state to provide that education. So if I'm at a state level, at a ministry level, what I think fundamentally needs to shift is the lens with which I view the system, which is towards this idea of equity, and away from the idea of a narrow view of achievement scores or simply access, but how is that equitably distributed, and how is quality ensured, and how are you making the maximum progress towards that at this point, obviously without retrogression, but with the maximum available resources. And I think that is something that is varies by country, but that every country needs to be taking that next step. This is where we are headed. And it is about sitting down and using the tools that are becoming available at the international level, the indicators, the thinking, the frameworks, and applying them in your local education system. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is hard. There are a lot of pressures. The technology companies, everybody's offering one-stop solutions. But I will say that, there is no such thing as a free lunch. And you have to ask yourself, what is the public cost of what is being offered here? And how might I do things differently, and challenge myself and my situation to really do the equity work that really guarantees our human right to education? And with that, I will leave it. Thank you, Amelie and
Thanks
IIEPA.
so much. Thank you, Frank, for these last words. Thank you, Camila, for being with us. Your comments were extremely rich, and I think will give us food for thought for a while. Frank Adamson, it was nice to spend every Wednesday with you over the last month. It feels like with all these recurring participants, it feels now that we know well each other, and that it's almost like a family gathering now every Wednesday. So let's see what we'll do next. Please let me take just a few minutes to thank Camila again, of course, but also OSF Foundation for allowing us to invite Camila, but also to have interpretation in many languages. Thanks to the interpreters for being with us all the time. Thanks to the 193 participants that were with us today. And thanks, of course, to every colleague that was involved in making this weekly appointment a success. So let me just put back the URL on the chat box. Everything will be available there. Please continue the discussion online. We'll be happy to engage further all together. And with this, I'll say see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.